story begins. Everyone in Caldwell Street knew Marcus Dell by reputation before they ever stepped through his door. They knew him as the man who would offer you $40 for a watch your grandmother wore to her own wedding. They knew him as the man who kept a cigarette behind his left ear, even though nobody had ever seen him smoke it. They knew him as the man whose shop smelled like old leather and machine oil, and something else underneath both of those things. Something metallic and faintly wrong, like the inside of an old ammunition box left too long in a basement. What they did not know was why he never argued with them. Not once. In 11 years of running Dell's exchange on the corner of Caldwell and Merritt, Marcus Dell had never raised his voice, never told a customer they were wrong, never pushed back when someone said his appraisal was insulting, that their grandfather's pocket watch was worth 3 times what he offered, that they would take it somewhere else. He just nodded, folded his hands on the glass counter and waited. Sometimes they left, more often they didn't. The neighborhood had constructed its version of him from these observations and a few others. He was greedy, clearly. He was cold. He had no wife, no children anyone knew about, no friends who visited the shop during business hours. He drove a 10-year-old truck that he parked in the same spot on Merritt every morning at 7:43, and he walked to the shop without looking at anything. Not the sky, not the other storefronts, not the people passing him on the sidewalk. He walked like a man moving through a space that didn't fully exist for him. But that wasn't the full story. Not even close. The shop itself was long and narrow, like a hallway that had decided to become a room. Display cases ran the length of both walls, illuminated from below by fluorescent strips that gave everything a slightly clinical pallor. Watches on velvet backing, rings and bracelets in ascending rows. A collection of vintage lighters that Marcus had never once tried to sell because he felt, obscurely, that selling them would be wrong. In the back, behind a beaded curtain that nobody was invited past, the real inventory lived. Instruments, cameras, military surplus, things that people brought in during the worst weeks of their lives and never came back to reclaim. Marcus catalogued everything. Every item that came through the door received a handwritten card in his narrow, precise script. Date received. Condition. Serial number if applicable. Estimated value. And one line at the bottom that no standard pawnshop form ever included. What he called the provenance note. 1 or 2 sentences about where the thing came from, if the person had told him. Or, if they hadn't told him, what he could deduce from the object itself. He had learned to read objects the way other people read faces. The scratches on a watch crystal, for instance, told him something about handedness and habit. A ring worn smooth on the inside of the band, not the outside, belonged to someone who worked with their hands and had learned, over decades, to rotate it so the stone sat on the palm side during labor. A camera lens with fog on the rear element, but not the front, had spent years in a bag, not on display, used seriously, not decoratively. His regulars, the handful of people who visited the shop for reasons other than desperation, sometimes caught him studying an object with an expression they could not fully categorize. It was not greed. It was not calculation. It was something older and quieter than either of those things. Nobody knew what to make of it, so they made nothing of it. They called him cold and moved on. What happened next, on a Thursday in October, changed everything. The morning Marcus Dell's world started like every other morning. He unlocked the front at 8:00, made coffee in the small room behind the beaded curtain using a percolator that had belonged to the previous tenant and that Marcus had never bothered to replace. The coffee it produced was dense and slightly bitter, the kind that sits in your chest and reminds you it's there. He drank it standing up, reading nothing, looking at the back wall where a single photograph was pinned above the cluttered workbench. The photograph showed 7 men in military gear standing in a muddy clearing. Eastern European landscape visible behind them, low hills, birch trees stripped of leaves, sky the color of old steel. The men were arranged loosely, not posed, like someone had told them to stop moving for a second and captured them mid-rest. Their faces were unreadable at the photograph scale, but their posture communicated the specific kind of exhaustion that goes deeper than sleep. Marcus had looked at that photograph every morning for 11 years. He had never explained it to anyone. At 8:47, the first customer arrived, a young woman, maybe 22, bringing in a tablet computer with a cracked screen. Marcus gave her $60 for it without discussion. She seemed surprised. He said nothing. At 10:15, an older man came in with a coin collection. The man believed it was valuable. It was not valuable. Marcus told him this in the same flat, neutral tone he used for everything, and the man left angry. Marcus wrote his note card, filed the 2 coins the man had left anyway, and returned to his coffee. At 11:02, the door opened again. Marcus did not look up immediately. He was finishing a note on the tablet, trying to remember the model number from memory. He heard the door close, heard footsteps on the concrete floor, heard the sound that objects make when placed on glass, a specific, careful sound, like someone setting down something they considered important. He looked up. The man standing on the other side of the counter was young, mid-20s maybe. He wore a canvas jacket over a gray t-shirt, and his hands were on the glass counter in the attitude of someone who had rehearsed what they were going to say and was now uncertain whether to say it. He had light brown hair that needed cutting and eyes that moved too quickly around the shop, cataloging exits the way people do when they've been taught to catalog exits. On the counter between his hands sat a wooden box. Not a decorative box, not a jewelry box or a keepsake box or any of the 100 varieties of wooden container that came through pawnshop doors. This box was military issue, or had been once. The olive drab paint had worn through to bare wood in patches, and where the paint remained, it had faded to a color that was more gray than green, the specific gray of things that have spent years in storage facilities or in the back of vehicles or in the hands of people too busy staying alive to worry about maintenance. The brass hardware on the box, hinges, clasp, handle, had oxidized to dark brown. The handle itself had been replaced at some point with a length of paracord, the knot worn tight and smooth with use. Marcus looked at the box, then at the young man, then at the box again. "What is it?" he said. "I don't know exactly," the young man said. "That's kind of why I'm here." But that wasn't the full story. Marcus could see that much already. The young man's name was Owen Price. He said this without being asked, which meant he had decided, somewhere between walking in and reaching the counter, to be forthcoming. Marcus filed that observation next to the others and waited. Owen had found the box 3 days ago, cleaning out the storage unit his father had left behind. His father had died in August, a fact Owen delivered with the specific flatness of recent grief, the kind that hasn't had time to settle into any particular shape yet. The storage unit was in Garfield, one of those climate-controlled facilities behind a strip mall, full of things his father had apparently been paying to store for years without discussing with anyone. Most of it was ordinary. Furniture, boxes of books, a snowblower that had never been used, and then, pushed to the back wall and covered with an old canvas tarp, a military footlocker. Inside the footlocker, nested inside a wool blanket, the olive drab box. There was a note, Owen said. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a folded piece of paper. Set it on the counter beside the box. On the footlocker, not the box. Like he left it there in case someone found it. Marcus did not touch the paper. What does it say? Owen had clearly read it enough times to have memorized it. It says, "Don't open this around people you don't trust. Find someone who knows what they're looking at. They'll know what it is. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you while I was alive." The shop was quiet. Outside on Caldwell, a bus ground through its gears and moved on. Marcus looked at the box for a long time. Then he said, "Did you open it?" "Yes." "And?" Owen reached out and unlatched the clasp, lifted the lid. Inside, on a bed of deteriorated foam padding, lay a single object. A military decoration. A medal in its original presentation case. Velvet backing so old it had compressed to a thin layer of dark fiber. The medal itself attached to a ribbon that had faded from its original color to something between rust and brown. The metal was tarnished almost to black. The design was partly obscured. But what Marcus saw first was not the medal. It was the case itself, specifically the interior of the lid. Someone had affixed a small paper label there, handwritten, the ink faded but legible. A number. Letters and numbers combined in a specific format that Marcus recognized before he fully registered recognizing it. His hand, moving toward the box to examine it more closely, stopped. "Where did your father serve?" Marcus asked. His voice was exactly the same as it always was. He had practiced that over many years. Owen blinked. He never said, he was in the army, that much I knew, but he didn't talk about it. When? I don't know exactly. He would have been in his 20s in the late 90s, so late 90s, I guess, maybe early 2000s. Marcus looked at the code on the label again, looked at the metal, looked at the code. Late 90s. Owen's father would have been the right age, the right generation for what that code represented. He felt something move in his chest, something that was not quite pain, and not quite recognition, and not quite fear, but contained elements of all three. "Give me a minute," he said. He turned and went through the beaded curtain. No one expected what came next. Behind the curtain, Marcus stood at the workbench and looked at the photograph on the wall. 7 men, muddy clearing, birch trees, steel-gray sky. He counted the figures, which he had done before, thousands of mornings, without thinking about why. 1 through 7. He always stopped at the third one from the left, the tallest, the one whose posture was slightly different from the others, a tilt to the head, a set to the shoulders, that spoke of someone whose attention was always fractionally elsewhere, always listening for something the others hadn't heard yet. Marcus had not thought this man's name in a very long time. He thought it now. Daniel. He pressed his fingers against the surface of the workbench, feeling the grain of the wood, feeling the present moment, anchoring himself in it the way he had learned to anchor himself over years of deliberate practice. The past was the past. The past stayed where it was put. That had been the understanding. That had been the entire point of the life he had built on this corner of Caldwell and Merritt. He went back out through the curtain. Owen was still standing at the counter, hands in his jacket pockets now, looking at the walls. His eyes had settled on a rack of vintage cameras. "Your father's name," Marcus said. Owen turned. "Price. Robert Price." Marcus had known men named Robert in that period of his life. It was a common name. He had known a Robert T. who died of a stroke at 47, and a Robert A. who had become a hardware store owner in rural Colorado, and a Robert M. who had simply stopped responding to any form of contact after 2004, which was a thing that happened. "Middle name?" Marcus said. Owen seemed surprised by the question. "Daniel. Robert Daniel Price. He went by Rob." The name landed. Marcus kept his face the same. He had kept his face the same through things much larger than this. "How old was your father when he died?" he asked. 49. The math worked. Exactly the right age, the right name, the right time frame. And the code in the box was the one that Marcus had memorized 22 years ago in a briefing room in a building that no longer existed, in a city that had since been rebuilt into something almost unrecognizable. And that code had belonged, at that time, to an operation that was classified at a level that meant classified didn't quite cover it. Marcus looked at Owen Price, standing in his shop, holding his dead father's secrets, and felt the specific vertigo of a life that had been very carefully constructed, beginning to tilt. And that's when things took a darker turn. He needed to be certain. That was the first thought. The second thought was that certainty in this situation carried its own weight, its own consequences, its own chain of events that he could not fully see from where he was standing. "Leave this with me," Marcus said. "Come back tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock. Owen studied him. "You know what it is, don't you?" Not a question. The young man was perceptive. Given who his father was, that made a certain amount of sense. "I need to verify something," Marcus said. "That's all. You changed when you saw the label in the lid. You changed. Come back tomorrow, 9 o'clock. I'll tell you what I can tell you." Owen looked at the box, then at Marcus. Something passed across his face. A conflict between the desire to know and the awareness that knowing would change things in ways he could not yet calculate. Marcus recognized that conflict. He had been living inside a version of it for 22 years. "Okay," Owen said. He left the box on the counter and walked out. Marcus stood alone in the shop. He reached into the display case below the counter and removed a jeweler's loupe, carried the box to the workbench behind the curtain, positioned it under the task lamp, put on cotton gloves. He began to examine it. The code on the label corresponded to a unit designation and an operation number. The operation number was one he knew. The unit designation was one of 12 that had existed within that operation. His own had been different. He had been in a different element, working a different sector of the same theater, and their paths had only crossed twice in the field and once in a briefing. But he had been briefed on all 12 unit designations. He had memorized them because that was what you did. You memorized everything that could save your life or someone else's. The medal itself, once he carefully cleaned the tarnish from a small section near the edge, revealed its true nature. Not a standard military decoration, not anything that would appear in a catalogue or on a ceremonial display. A unit citation, custom manufactured, the kind that existed as internal recognition within programs that did not officially exist. He had seen 2 others like it in his life, both in the hands of men who had been, at various points, very carefully not present in certain locations. The verification took 3 hours. At the end of it, Marcus sat on the stool he kept behind the workbench and looked at the ceiling and breathed slowly for a long time. Robert Daniel Price had been Callaway 7. Marcus had been Callaway 3. They had been in the same operation. Different elements, different sectors, the same mission architecture. And Robert Price had died in August at 49 years old, taking everything he knew into whatever came after knowing things. Except for the box. The box he had left for his son to find. Marcus looked at the photograph on the wall, counted the figures again, stopped at the 3rd from the left. He had been wrong about which figure he always stopped at. He had always told himself it was the tallest one, the one with the different posture. But sitting here now, with the box open on the workbench beside him, he admitted to himself for the first time what he had always actually known. It wasn't the tallest figure he stopped at. It was the 4th from the left, the shortest. The one who stood slightly apart from the group, facing a different direction than everyone else, already looking at something the camera couldn't see. That was him. That was Marcus Dell, who had not been Marcus Dell in that photograph, who had been something else entirely. What happened next, he had not anticipated for 22 years. He did not sleep. This was not unusual. He had not slept reliably in many years. But the particular quality of this night's wakefulness was different. Normally the sleeplessness was a background condition, managed, filed under the category of things he had learned to function around. This night it had character. It moved through him like weather. He sat in the apartment above the shop, which was small and ordered and contained almost nothing decorative, and thought about what he was going to say to Owen Price in the morning. The honest answer to what the box contained was not a simple sentence. It was a narrative. And narratives, Marcus had learned, had consequences. They spread. They changed the people who heard them. They created obligations. He had left that life specifically to escape obligation, not from weakness, from the understanding, arrived at slowly and at significant cost, that he was not capable of continuing to carry the weight of it without becoming something he did not want to be. So he had become Marcus Dell, the pawnbroker on Caldwell and Merritt, who offered you $40 for your grandmother's watch, and never explained himself, and never smiled, and never seemed to be fully present in the room. He had become this person deliberately, and maintained him carefully. And the maintenance had required, above everything else, the erasure of the person who had preceded him. But the box sitting downstairs in his locked-back room was evidence that erasure was not always permanent. Robert Price had kept his box, had kept it in a storage unit behind a strip mall in Garfield, paying climate-controlled rent on it for, how long? Years, clearly. The Foot Locker, The tarp, the wool blanket. That was not casual storage. That was careful preservation. Robert Price had not forgotten what he had been. He had stored it. And when he died, he had pointed his son toward it. Why? Marcus thought about this for most of the night. He thought about what Robert Price had known that he himself did not. He thought about the note. Don't open this around people you don't trust. Find someone who knows what they're looking at. He thought about the phrase, I'm sorry I couldn't tell you while I was alive. By 4 in the morning he had a theory. By 6 he was fairly certain the theory was correct. By 8 he was downstairs making coffee, and the theory had hardened into something that felt very much like dread. Owen Price arrived at 9:03. Marcus had placed the box on the glass counter. He had also placed beside it a cup of coffee he had poured without asking. Owen looked at the coffee, then at Marcus, then at the box. Sit down, Marcus said. There was no place to sit in the front of the shop. Owen looked around, confused. Marcus went through the curtain and came back with the stool from the workbench, set it on the customer side of the counter. Owen sat. Marcus stood on his side. He looked at the box, then at Owen, and then he did something he had not done in 11 years in this shop. He told the truth, not all of it, but the part that mattered. Your father and I served in the same operation, he said. Not the same element. We weren't close, but we were in the same architecture. Owen's hands were very still on his knees. What operation? That's the part I can give you in broad terms. I can't give you specifics, not because I'm protecting myself. Those protections aren't really relevant anymore. Because the specifics involve other people who made their own decisions about what to carry forward and what to leave behind. And those decisions weren't mine to override. What broad terms? Marcus looked at the box. Kosovo, 1998 and 1999. The period before and during the NATO intervention. There were programs running in that theater that weren't part of the official military framework. Intelligence programs. Direct action programs. He paused. Programs that served real purposes and that produced real results and that were never going to be officially acknowledged. Because the methods required for that kind of work, in that environment, didn't fit inside the official framework. Owen was quiet for a moment. What does that mean, in practical terms? It means your father did things that mattered, difficult things, things that didn't have an appropriate form to file afterward. Another pause. Things that, for certain people, when left marks. What kind of marks? Marcus looked at him steadily. The kind you pay climate-controlled storage rent on for 20 years. No one expected what came next. Owen Price was quiet for a long time after that. Not the quiet of incomprehension, the quiet of someone reconfiguring. Marcus had watched people reconfigure before. It took different amounts of time depending on the person and the information. Sometimes it happened fast, the new understanding snapping into place like a bone set. Sometimes it was slower, more tectonic, the old framework giving way in stages. Owen was somewhere in between. Marcus could see it happening in the quality of his stillness. He never talked about it, Owen said finally. No, not once. I knew he was Army. I knew he'd been deployed. When I was little, he used to. He had nightmares. I could hear him through the wall. But when I was old enough to ask about it, he just said it was a long time ago, and he was fine. That's what people say. Owen looked at the box. Is that what you say? Marcus considered the question. I'm not a person who has conversations about this, typically. But you're having one now. Your father left you the box. He left a note pointing you toward someone who would know what they were looking at. Marcus kept his voice level. I think he anticipated this conversation. I think he left the infrastructure for it. Owen frowned. You think he knew you were here? On Caldwell Street? I think he might have. That was the part of the theory that had crystallized at 4 in the morning. Robert Price had been in the same operation. Different element, different sector, but the same architecture, which meant the same administrative support, the same debrief processes, the same exit procedures. The exit procedures for that program involved the creation of new civilian identities. Marcus had become Marcus Dell, Pawnbroker, Caldwell, and Merritt. Robert Price had become, apparently, Robert Daniel Price of Garfield, with a storage unit full of things he couldn't bring himself to throw away. But the exit procedures also involved, for a period of several years, periodic welfare checks conducted through intermediaries. Discreet, deniable, a monitoring system to ensure that the people who had been reconstituted into civilian life were not decompensating in ways that would create problems. During one of those welfare checks many years ago, Marcus had been informed, not directly, through layers of intermediary, that another former member of the Callaway operation was living in the greater metropolitan area. He had not pursued that information. He had filed it under the category of things that stayed where they were put. But Robert Price, apparently, had been less successful at filing, and that's when things took a darker turn. "There's something else in the box," Marcus said. Owen looked at it. "The metal is the only thing I saw." "Lift the foam padding." Owen reached into the box, lifted the deteriorated foam. Beneath it, in a shallow false bottom that had been constructed with careful craftsmanship, lay a folded piece of paper. Owen unfolded it with the careful movements of someone who understood, instinctively, that what they were holding had been waiting a long time to be unfolded. He read it. Marcus watched his face. The paper contained, as best Marcus could reconstruct from his overnight theorizing, a list of names. He didn't know exactly. He hadn't looked into the false bottom himself, had only known it was there because he had seen boxes with false bottoms before, in briefing rooms and in the hands of men who were very careful about what they carried where. He knew it was a list of names because Owen's face, as he read, moved through a sequence of expressions that corresponded to recognizing people. Not faces, but names, the particular quality of recognition that comes from reading a name you know. "Some of these people," Owen started. "Don't say them out loud," Marcus said. "Reflex, automatic." Owen looked up at him. Something new in his expression now, not fear exactly, but adjacent to it. "Are they in trouble?" he said. "I don't know. That's the honest answer. My father thought they were." Owen looked at the paper again. "There are notes next to some of the names, years. Some of them have... There's a symbol. It looks like a small cross." Marcus held himself very still. "How many of the crosses?" Owen counted quietly, moved his finger down the page, counted again. "7, he said. 7. Marcus felt something cold move through him that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. 12 unit designations. 12 elements in the Callaway architecture. He had been Callaway 3. Robert Price had been Callaway 7. If the list contained all 12 designations, and 7 of them now bore crosses, that meant more than half of the people who had operated in that framework were gone. He was 51 years old. Robert Price had been 49. Neither of those was a natural death age for men in otherwise reasonable health. Owen was looking at him across the counter with the specific expression of someone who has just understood that the thing they're holding is heavier than they thought. "What does the cross mean?" he said, though his face suggested he already knew. Marcus looked at the photograph on the back wall, counted the figures, stopped. "It means your father was keeping track," he said. What happened next changed everything. Marcus had closed the shop before, midday, when circumstances required it. Once for a death in the neighborhood that required his quiet presence as a witness. Once for a plumbing emergency. Once for a reason he had never explained to anyone and would not explain now. He flipped the sign to closed and locked the front door. Owen sat on the stool on the customer side of the counter, the unfolded paper in his hands, the box open beside him. Marcus stood on his side and thought carefully about what sequence of actions was appropriate. The box was, in technical terms, evidence. Evidence of a program that had officially never existed. The medal was proof of conduct within that program. Proof that the person who earned it had done something significant enough to merit internal recognition in a context where internal recognition was not given lightly. The paper in the false bottom was something more specific. A document that Robert Price had compiled over years or possibly decades, tracking the status of people who had been his colleagues in an architecture that had ended, and then, like all ended things, had continued in its consequences. 7 crosses. Marcus had known, in the abstract, that former operators from programs like Callaway did not always thrive in civilian life. The reconstitution procedures were better in theory than in practice. You could give a person a new name, and a rental deposit, and a cover story, and a contact number that would be answered for exactly 18 months before being disconnected. You could not give them the particular neural circuitry that would allow them to translate what they had done into something that fit inside a normal life. Some of them drank. Some of them developed patterns that looked, from the outside, like mental illness. Some of them simply and quietly stopped. Chronic conditions, accidents, circumstances that did not invite close examination, 7 out of 12. Marcus thought about Robert Price paying rent on a storage unit in Garfield for years. He thought about what it meant to maintain something that carefully, for that long, that secretly. It meant Robert Price had been planning, or at minimum, hoping, preparing for a conversation that he believed needed to happen. "Your father," Marcus said. "What did he do? For work? After?" Owen considered. He was a security consultant, corporate security. Did risk assessment for companies that operated in. He traveled a lot. Eastern Europe, Middle East, sometimes Southeast Asia. That fit. It was one of the common trajectories for people with a particular skill set who needed to maintain a civilian profile while still operating in environments they understood. Marcus himself had considered it years ago, before settling on something he had thought would put more distance between his present and his past. He was now reconsidering the effectiveness of that distance. Did he work alone or for a firm? He had a small firm, 2 or 3 other people, but in the last couple of years he mostly worked alone. He said the firm had wound down. Did he say why? Owen was quiet. Not exactly. He said it had run its course. A pause. He seemed... Another pause, longer. He seemed scared, I think. Last couple of years. I couldn't point to anything specific, but the way he moved through spaces changed. He was always careful, but it became something different, more deliberate. Marcus thought about that. A man with Robert Price's background would not become scared of ordinary things. He would have spent years calibrating his threat assessment, learning to distinguish real danger from the ambient anxiety of traumatic memory. If he had become scared in his last years, it was because he had perceived something real, and he had left a box with 7 crosses in a false bottom. "I need to make a phone call," Marcus said. "Now?" "Yes. Go get more coffee if you want. Pot is behind the curtain." He went through the curtain and stood at the workbench and stared at the photograph for 30 seconds. Then he opened the locked cabinet beneath the workbench, not the filing cabinet, a different one, smaller, the kind that required both a key and a 4-digit code, and removed a phone that was not the phone he used for the shop. It was a different kind of phone, of a different age, and it had a different set of numbers stored in its memory. Most of those numbers, when he had periodically checked, went to nothing. Disconnected lines, changed numbers, people who had stopped being reachable. There was one number that he had not tried in 6 years. He had told himself this was because there was nothing to say to that number. He understood now that this had not been entirely honest. He dialed it. It rang 4 times. Then it was answered. The voice on the other end was older than Marcus remembered it, and more careful, and had the quality of a voice that has spent years being careful and is tired of it. "I was wondering," the voice said, "when I got the news in August. I wondered when you'd call." Marcus closed his eyes briefly. "You know about the box." "I know about Rob. I found out in September, through the usual channels. When you didn't call then, I thought—" The voice stopped, reconsidered. "I thought you were going to stay behind your wall. His son came into my shop today." A pause. "Owen. You knew he'd find it." Rob told me, the last time we spoke. He said he'd set things up so Owen would eventually find the box and eventually find someone who could contextualize it. Another pause. I didn't know it would be you specifically. Rob might have. He tracked people more carefully than the rest of us. The list, Marcus said. 7 names with crosses. The pause this time was longer. Yes, the voice said. Natural? Some of them. Some of them. It's been 22 years, Marcus. We were not young when we started. The probability, Marcus said, of 7 out of 12 former operators dying within 22 years of the end of a program, with most of them clustering in the last 4 years, is not a number I find statistically comfortable. The voice on the other end was quiet for a long moment. Neither did Rob, it said finally. No one expected what came next. The person on the phone was a woman named Petra Vasic. She had been Callaway 9. Marcus had met her 3 times in the field and once in a debriefing room in Vienna in 2001, which had been the last time any of them had been in a room together. She was 2 years older than Marcus and had apparently been living in a mid-sized city in the Pacific Northwest under a name he had not known and did not ask for now. She told him what she knew. It took 20 minutes. What she knew was this. Robert Price had, in the final 2 years of his life, been investigating the deaths of the former Callaway operators. Not officially, not with any sanction, with the particular focused determination of a man who had a set of skills and a theory and a growing conviction that the theory was correct. His theory was that the Callaway program had not simply ended. Programs did not simply end. They left things behind. Resources, knowledge, people who knew things that other people would pay to know or would pay to ensure remained unknown. In the years following the program's official termination, those who had participated had been dispersed, reconstituted, and, in theory, forgotten. But the knowledge they carried was not forgotten. Their operational records, classified and sealed, still existed somewhere. Their identities, both former and new, still existed in files that had been created, and that files do not uncreate themselves simply because programs end. Robert Price had become convinced in his last years that someone was working through those files. Working through, in the sense that people do when they are trying to eliminate something they consider a liability. 7 out of 12. Petra Vasic had thought at first that Rob was becoming paranoid. It was a common trajectory for people from their background, the hypervigilance that had kept them alive in the field, becoming, in civilian life, a threat detection system calibrated to a threat environment that no longer existed. She had tried to reassure him. She had been, she said quietly, less thorough about it than she should have been. Then, Rob had died. Heart failure, the death certificate said. He had been 49 and in reasonable health and had not had a family history of cardiac events. Petra Vasic had not thought he was paranoid after that. He was building a case, she told Marcus. The list in the box is part of it. But he had more. Documentation. He was thorough. You remember how thorough he was. Marcus did not remember Rob Price as thorough. He had barely known the man. But he could extrapolate, from the existence of the box and the note and the false bottom and the years of careful storage, what thorough looked like in this particular person. Where is the rest of it? Marcus asked. I don't know exactly. He told me it was distributed, in pieces, in places that Owen could find if Owen looked. He told you this. In our last conversation, 6 weeks before he died. Her voice was steady, but barely. He said if anything happened to him, Owen would figure it out. He said he'd set it up so Owen didn't need to know what he was looking for, just needed to look. Marcus thought about the young man sitting on the stool on the other side of the counter, drinking shop coffee, holding a list of dead people. Why Owen? Marcus said. Why not go to someone who had the tools to... Because everyone who had the tools was either on the list, Petra said, or involved in putting people on it. The silence that followed that sentence was the loudest thing Marcus had heard in a long time, and that's when things took a darker turn. He went back through the curtain. Owen was standing at the wall of cameras, not looking at them, looking at the floor. His hands were in his pockets, and his posture had the particular quality of a person thinking very hard about something they are not yet ready to say. Marcus sat down on his side of the counter. "Tell me about the last 2 years of your father's life," he said. Owen turned. "What specifically?" "What?" "Anything that seemed different. Changes in routine, changes in behavior. Things he said or did that didn't fit the pattern of who he was." Owen came back to the counter and sat on the stool. He looked at the box for a moment before speaking. "He stopped traveling," he said. 18 months ago, maybe 2 years. He'd always traveled. That was his whole life, basically. And then suddenly he wasn't. He said the consulting work had dried up." "Had it?" "I assume so. He seemed careful about money. But then I found out when I was going through his things that he actually had. He had more money than I expected. So either he'd saved a lot, or he was still working and just not saying it was work." "What else?" "He changed his phone, twice. I noticed because he'd had the same number for years, and then suddenly different numbers. He said the old provider had coverage issues." Owen paused. "He started calling me more. Not about anything specific, just checking in. More than he used to. I thought it was a getting older thing. He was turning 50. Did he ever ask you to do anything? Store anything for him? Remember anything?" Owen was quiet. A different quality of quiet than before. "He asked me to remember one thing," he said. "About 3 months before he died. We were on the phone, nothing unusual, and at the end of the call he just said it. Out of nowhere." "What did he say?" Owen's jaw worked for a moment. He said, "You remember that thing I always said about maps, that the most important point on a map is the one that isn't marked?" I said, "Yeah, I remembered. Because he used to say it when I was little. I thought it was just something he said, and he said, 'Good, don't forget that.' And then he said goodbye, and that was that." Marcus looked at the box, at the metal, at the folded paper with the list. "The most important point on a map is the one that isn't marked." It was not a phrase about maps. "He was telling you there was something else," Marcus said. "Something not in the box." Owen had already come to this conclusion. Marcus could see it in his face, the reluctant arrival at an answer he hadn't wanted to pursue, because pursuing it meant continuing down a road he hadn't chosen to start on. "There's a storage unit," Owen said slowly, "separate from the one in Garfield. I found a receipt for it when I was going through the paper files he kept. Different facility. I hadn't gone there yet because I wasn't sure I wanted to." "Where?" 15 minutes from here." Marcus looked at the locked shop, at the box, at the young man his dead colleague had pointed from beyond his own death toward this particular corner of Caldwell and Merritt. He thought about the life he had constructed here, the intentional forgetting, the careful maintenance of a person who had replaced the person he had been. He thought about 7 crosses on a list. He thought about what Petra Vasic had said. Everyone who had the tools was either on the list or involved in putting people on it. He had the tools. He had been careful, for 22 years, to ensure that nobody knew he had them. He had hidden them inside the identity of a man who offered $40 for wedding watches and never smiled. It had not, apparently, been sufficient concealment, because the fact of his existence on Calloway 3 had been known to someone who had begun working through the list. And if that was true, then Marcus Dell, pawnbroker, Caldwell and Merritt, was only as safe as the time it took for that someone to reach the C-section. He made a decision. What happened next changed everything. The second storage facility was 15 minutes east, in a part of the city that Marcus did not often visit. It sat behind a gas station in a neighborhood that had been in various stages of becoming something new for as long as Marcus could remember, which meant it remained exactly what it had always been. Marcus drove. Owen sat in the passenger seat of the 10-year-old truck and did not ask questions, which Marcus appreciated. The unit number was on the receipt. Owen had photographed it, along with the access code, when he'd found it in his father's paper files. The code worked. The lock opened. The rolling door went up. The unit was smaller than the one in Garfield. No furniture, no boxes of books, just a single metal shelving unit against the back wall, and, on its 3 shelves, a collection of things arranged with careful deliberateness. A laptop, sealed in a waterproof case. A series of external hard drives in labeled sleeves. A binder, thick, blue, with a spine label that read only "Record" in black marker. And on the bottom shelf, in a plain cardboard box, a collection of physical files. Paper files, old school. The kind you kept when you knew that digital storage had vulnerabilities that paper did not. Owen reached for the binder. "Let me," Marcus said. He put on the cotton gloves he had brought from the shop, not for forensic reasons, but because handling things carefully was a habit so deeply ingrained that it operated independently of conscious decision. He lifted the binder, carried it to the rear bumper of the truck, which served as a surface, and opened it. The first section was an index, organized by name and designation. All 12 Callaway operators listed with their real names on one column, and in an adjacent column, the designations they had operated under. Marcus saw his own real name, the one he had not used in 22 years, and felt the specific vertigo of encountering your former self in documentation. The second section was a timeline, beginning in 2018 and running to within 6 weeks of Robert Price's death. Entries dated and noted, each entry corresponded to a name on the list, circumstances of death for those marked with crosses. In several cases, cause of death as officially recorded, followed by a second line in parentheses that read differently. Marcus read through 7 entries. Heart failure, no cardiac history, recent comprehensive physical showed clear. Last contact 11 days prior, seemed well. Traffic accident, single vehicle, dry conditions, experienced driver. Road familiar from 30 years of regular travel. Suicide. No prior episodes, no communication indicators. 2 weeks earlier arranged updated will and contacted estranged daughter. Suicide. Marcus stopped on that one. He read the note in parentheses, which was longer than the others, more detailed, more personal. He understood that Rob Price had known this person well. The parenthetical note had the quality of an argument being made to someone who needed convincing, including perhaps to Price himself. Fell from height. Official, intoxication. Toxicology report not publicly released. Subject had not consumed alcohol in 11 years. Illness. Aggressive presentation. Rapid deterioration from initial diagnosis to death. 6 weeks. Treating physician noted unusual speed of progression. The 7th cross, the most recent. Marcus read the name, read the designation, read the date. His jaw tightened. He closed the binder and looked at the shelving unit and thought about what Robert Price had assembled here, over years, in a storage unit 15 minutes from a pawnshop on Caldwell Street. A case. A documented, sourced, cross-referenced case. The kind of case that could not be ignored if it reached the right hands. The kind of case that made a very specific argument about what had happened to 7 people and what was likely to continue happening. Owen was standing behind him, quiet. Marcus could feel the young man trying to read his posture. "Is it what you thought it was?" Owen said. Marcus closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, he said, "Your father was a thorough man. Is it enough? Whatever he put together, is it enough?" Marcus looked at the shelving unit, at the laptop and the drives and the binder and the paper files. 22 years of distance, collapsing. "It depends on who sees it," he said. No one expected what came next. They sat in the truck in the parking lot of the storage facility for a long time. The engine was off. Cars moved on the street beyond the gate. A pigeon landed on the hood of the truck and looked at them with the specific indifference of pigeons, then left. Marcus was thinking about Petra Vasic, about what she had said, about the constraint it represented. Within the Callaway architecture, the people who had possessed the institutional knowledge to understand what Robert Price had assembled were sorted into 2 categories. The first category was the list in the false bottom. People who had been in the program and were therefore targets, witnesses, or both. The second category was the institutional structure that had overseen the program, the people who had run it, funded it, directed it, and then quietly sealed it. The second category was where the danger was, not necessarily because everyone in it was complicit, but because institutional structures protect themselves, and the mechanism of protection, the desire for a classified program to remain classified, for accountability to be avoided, for uncomfortable truths to stay buried, created the conditions under which 7 people could die in ways that were plausible enough individually, but that told a different story at the aggregate level. Rob Price had understood this. He had built his case not to take to the institutional structure, but around it. Physical documentation in multiple formats, stored in a location tied to a paper trail that his son could follow, designed to surface through a chain of people who were credible witnesses rather than institutional actors. The weak point in that design was the same as its strength. It depended on the people in the chain being willing to carry it forward. Marcus thought about what he was, at 51, in this particular body, in this particular life. He thought about the tools Petra Vasic had mentioned, the skills, the knowledge, the operational awareness that had not disappeared simply because he had stopped using them. He had maintained them the way someone maintains a language they no longer speak, present but quiet, kept alive by occasional exercise that he told himself was just habit. He thought about 5 remaining names on the list without crosses, including his own, including Petra Vasic's. "I need to tell you something," Marcus said. Owen turned. "You came to my shop because your father built a chain of information that was designed to bring you there. The note on the footlocker, the code in the box, the contact in my area who could verify what the box contained." Marcus looked at him steadily. "I think your father knew or suspected that I was on Caldwell and Merritt. I think he built the chain to include me specifically." Owen absorbed this. "Why you specifically?" "Because of what I was in that program. My element had a particular function. We were the people who, when other elements encountered problems that exceeded their operational parameters, we were the ones they called." He paused. "Your father had encountered a problem that exceeded his operational parameters, and he was looking for a way to hand it to someone who could carry it forward. He didn't just call you." "No." Marcus thought about that. "I think he knew I wouldn't answer a direct approach. I'd built too much wall. He needed to give me something I couldn't leave alone." Owen looked at the box on the back seat. "He gave you me," he said. Marcus had not quite formulated it that way. He sat with it for a moment. "He gave me a reason," he said. "That's different." Owen was quiet. Then, "What do you need from me?" And that's when things took a darker turn. What Marcus needed was time, specific contacts, and the contents of the laptop and hard drives. He explained this to Owen with the kind of precision that he had once used to brief operations, sequential, logical, accounting for contingencies. He explained that the documentation Robert Price had assembled was the foundation, but not sufficient by itself. Documentation without a channel to reach people who could act on it was a message that never arrived, and the channels through which such a message could travel were, in this particular situation, compromised in ways that required circumnavigation. Owen listened. He was, Marcus noted, good at listening. He asked clarifying questions at appropriate moments and did not ask questions that were unanswerable or irrelevant. He had clearly inherited something of his father's operational thinking. When Marcus finished, Owen said, "You're going to do what he couldn't. I'm going to try to finish what he started. That's different." "Why?" "You spent 22 years specifically not doing anything like this." "Yes. So what changed?" Marcus thought about the photograph on the back wall of the shop. The 7 figures, the one he'd always stopped at. "He spent 22 years keeping track," Marcus said, "paying storage rent, building documentation. And at the end of it, what he did was point his son towards someone who could carry it. He didn't ask me directly. He didn't show up at my door and demand. He just made it possible for me to choose." He looked at the dashboard, at his own hands on the steering wheel. Hands that had done careful things in muddy clearings with birch trees in the background. I've spent a long time choosing to not choose. That has its own costs. Owen was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "He would have liked you, I think." Marcus said nothing to that. He started the engine. What happened next changed everything. The first call Marcus made that afternoon was to Petra Vasic. He told her he was moving, that he needed a specific kind of assistance, the kind that existed in the gray spaces between official channels and complete informality. She knew what that meant. She had been navigating those spaces for her own reasons. She gave him two names, people she described as adjacent to accountability mechanisms, not inside them, not officially, but in positions from which they could be accessed, and from which, if the evidence warranted it, action could follow. Both names were in Washington. Both were, she said, the kind of people who had spent careers being bothered by the same category of thing that was bothering Marcus now. The second call was to a journalist. Not a celebrity journalist, not someone who covered geopolitics on television. A specific individual who worked for a publication that was small enough to be independent and large enough to have legal backing. Marcus had identified this person 3 years ago, during a period when he had been doing something he would have denied doing if asked, monitoring the public conversation around certain topics that intersected with his former life. The journalist had written, over several years, a series of pieces about accountability gaps in intelligence-adjacent programs. The pieces were careful and sourced, and they had not, as far as Marcus could tell, caused the journalist to experience any sudden cardiac events. He did not call this person yet. He called them in his mind, which was a preliminary step he had always taken before committing to communication, running through the parameters, identifying the risks, deciding whether the risk-benefit calculation supported proceeding. The benefit, in this case, was clear. The risk was also clear. He proceeded. The next 3 weeks had a quality that Marcus had not experienced in a very long time, not since the last operational period. There was a pressure to it, an alertness, a sense of inhabiting each hour fully rather than moving through it, in the careful managed way that civilian life usually required of him. He kept the shop open. He maintained the routine, the coffee at 8 the security check, the horizontal strokes on the display case glass. He offered customers their $40 for their grandmother's watches and filed his note cards in his narrow, precise script. Marcus Dell, pawnbroker. The surface of things unchanged. Underneath the surface he worked. Owen had given him access to the laptop and drives. Robert Price's documentation was more extensive than Marcus had been able to assess in a single afternoon in a storage unit. It was layered, cross-referenced, built with the care of someone who had understood that the people who would ultimately evaluate it would be skeptical and would need to be persuaded by volume and precision rather than assertion. Medical records where obtainable. Where? Public records. Private communications that Price had obtained through channels Marcus did not inquire about, choosing to assess the information rather than its provenance. Timeline correlations. Financial records suggesting, in several cases, that significant sums had moved through accounts belonging to people who were not on the Callaway list, but who had been in supervisory positions relative to the program. The financial records were the most significant element. They were the hardest to obtain and the hardest to refute. They told a story about what happened to programs that ended, but whose institutional knowledge did not. The monetization of that knowledge, the sale of operational data to parties who were willing to pay for it, and the subsequent management of the people who could complicate that transaction by being alive and remembering things. It was not a simple story. It was not clean. It involved multiple actors and multiple motivations, and the kind of institutional logic that produced consequences nobody had specifically intended, but that nobody had been sufficiently horrified by to prevent. 7 people had died as a consequence of institutional logic. Marcus worked steadily through the documentation, augmenting it with his own memory and with information from Petra Vasic, who had been doing her own version of this for months, and who was, by the time Marcus called her again 2 weeks in, more than ready to stop doing it alone. They did not meet in person. They communicated through channels that Marcus had maintained against the possibility that he would one day need them. The possibility had arrived. The journalist received a preliminary package, carefully curated, enough to establish credibility and indicate the scope of what was available, not enough to expose sources or compromise the broader documentation before the appropriate mechanisms were engaged. The journalist called back within 48 hours. The two names Petra Vasic had provided were contacted through intermediaries. One responded immediately. The other responded after a delay of 4 days that Marcus spent checking, with the particular heightened attention he had relearned, whether his environment had changed in ways that would indicate surveillance. It had not, or not detectably. He remained alert. Owen Price checked in every 3 days, not to push, not to ask for progress reports, simply to remain present and connected. He had taken leave from his job. He was an engineer at a small firm, nothing dramatic, nothing that intersected with any of this, and was handling the administrative aftermath of his father's death, which was considerable, and which gave him legitimate reasons to be in contact with the various institutions that his father had quietly touched over the years. On one of those check-ins, Owen said, "I've been thinking about something you said, about why you stayed behind your wall." Marcus waited. "You said it was because of what you'd become," continuing, "that you couldn't keep doing it without becoming something you didn't want to be." "Yes, but you're doing it now, and you don't seem like you're becoming something you don't want to be." Marcus considered this for a moment. "What I didn't want to become was someone who did those things without a reason that was sufficient. The work requires something very specific of the person who does it, and I had reached a point where the reason I was given wasn't sufficient to justify what that requirement extracted." He paused. "This is different." "What's the difference?" Marcus looked at the shop, at the display cases, at the photograph on the back wall. "This time I chose it," he said. "That's the whole difference." No one expected what came next. 5 weeks after Owen Price walked into Dell's exchange with an olive drab box, the first formal meeting happened. It was in Washington. Marcus drove, which took him through parts of the country he had not traveled in many years. He kept the radio off for most of it, which was how he had always driven when he needed to think. The meeting was in an office building that was entirely unremarkable, which was its function. The people inside it were also, on the surface, unremarkable. Mid-level government employees, career professionals, the kind of people whose titles did not suggest the actual weight of what they were able to set in motion. Marcus had met people like this before. He knew the particular fluency required. He knew which parts of what he knew to deploy first and which to hold back. He knew that the first meeting was not a decision meeting. It was an assessment meeting, in which the people on the other side of the table were determining whether he and the information he represented were credible and sufficiently protected to be worth the considerable institutional energy that actual action would require. He brought documentation. He brought Petra Vasic by telephone, which had been arranged in advance and which she agreed to despite reservations that she had articulated to Marcus privately and then set aside because setting them aside was what the situation required. He brought Owen Price's presence as a fact, not Owen himself, who had not been invited and who Marcus had decided to keep outside this particular room for reasons that were partly protective and partly operational. But the fact of Owen, the son of a dead operative, the finder of the box, the holder of the chain of custody that ran from a storage unit in Garfield to this unremarkable office in Washington. The meeting lasted 4 hours. Marcus had been in longer meetings in worse rooms. He was patient in the way that people who have spent time in observation positions learn to be patient, not passive, but present, attentive, spending the time acquiring information rather than simply enduring it. At the end of it, the senior person in the room looked at the documentation spread across the table and said something that Marcus had not been certain he would say. "We'll need to verify independently." "Of course," Marcus said. "This will take time." "I understand." "If verification supports the documentation," a pause, the specific pause of someone calculating what they are and are not authorized to promise, "there are mechanisms." "I know there are mechanisms," Marcus said. "I know which ones work and which ones don't. I'm asking for the ones that work." The senior person looked at him with the evaluative attention of someone who had spent a career assessing the people in front of them. "What is it you want from this?" the person asked. Marcus thought about that for a moment. "Accountability," he said, "and for the remaining 5 people on that list to stop appearing on it, including yourself." "Yes." The person nodded. "We'll be in touch." Marcus drove back through the unremarkable country between Washington and home and thought about what had been set in motion. Not certainty, not resolution, a process, a mechanism engaged, the outcome of which was not guaranteed and would not be for months, possibly years. But the box had been opened, the documentation existed, the chain of custody was intact, and the wall that had taken 22 years to build had developed a passage. He drove without the radio on and arrived back on Caldwell Street at 9:43 at night, parked the truck in its usual spot on Merritt, walked to the shop, not looking at the sky or the storefronts or the people passing, in the exact way he always walked. Except not exactly the same way. Something about it was different. He could not have said precisely what. He unlocked the shop and went in without turning on the lights. Stood in the dark for a moment, surrounded by the watches and rings and vintage lighters and the smell of old leather and machine oil. Then he turned on the backroom light only and went through the curtain and stood at the workbench and looked at the photograph on the wall. 7 figures, muddy clearing, birch trees. He was the 4th from the left, the one facing a different direction. He had been facing away from the group in that photograph because, in the moment it was taken, he had been watching the perimeter. That had been his function. Watching for what was coming from directions others weren't looking. It had turned out to be a lifelong function. Marcus looked at the 3rd figure from the left, the one he had spent 11 years telling himself he was looking at, tall, slightly different posture, head tilted. He reached up and took the photograph off the wall, turned it over. On the back, in handwriting that was not his, the photograph had been given to him by someone else at the program's end, as a kind of record, were the names of all 7 people, written in 2 columns. He read through them, found the name that corresponded to Callaway 7, Robert Daniel Price. Marcus touched the name with 1 finger, said nothing. There was nothing adequate to say. He put the photograph back on the wall, turned off the workroom light, went upstairs. He did not sleep, but the quality of the wakefulness was different from the previous nights. Quieter. The weather that had moved through him had not passed. It would not pass. But it had changed character, from urgent to something that might, over time, become habitual, something he could live alongside. At 7:43 he was in the truck. At 8 he unlocked the front door. He made the coffee in the percolator, drank it standing up, looking at nothing. At 8:34, his phone, not the shop phone, the other one, showed a message from Petra Vasic. 3 words, "They're looking properly." Marcus read it twice, put the phone in his pocket, went to the display cases and began cleaning them with horizontal strokes, left to right, top to bottom. The way his father had told him, no, that was Marcus Dell's father. He had constructed that habit for Marcus Dell. Before Marcus Dell, the habit had not existed. He cleaned the glass carefully, thoroughly. The way you cleaned something when you understood that what looked clean might still be obscuring what was underneath. What happened next would take time. He knew this. The mechanisms of accountability were slow and imperfect and would produce results that were, at best, partial. Some things could not be made right by process. Some costs were permanently sunk. But the documentation existed. The chain of custody was intact. The 5 remaining names on the list were known to people who now had reason to protect them. And Owen Price, who had walked into a pawn shop on a Thursday in October carrying a box he didn't understand, had been given something that Marcus suspected would matter more to him in the long run than any conclusion. The knowledge of who his father had been. The complete version. Not the careful silence and the travel and the phone numbers that changed, but the man underneath. The one who paid rent on a storage unit in Garfield for years, who built a case that could survive his own death, who trusted his son's instincts enough to leave a trail rather than directions. Marcus finished cleaning the display cases, stood at the counter. The bell above the door chimed. He looked up. It was a woman, 60 or so, carrying something wrapped in a canvas bag. She set it on the counter with the particular care of someone who understood, on some level, that what she was carrying was significant. She looked at Marcus with the expression of someone who had been told by someone they trusted to bring this here. Marcus unfolded his hands and placed them flat on the glass. "What do you have?" he said. He was asking the question he always asked, but he was asking it differently now. He was asking it the way someone asks when they understand that the answer might be a great deal more than it appears. When they have learned, at significant personal cost, that things left too long in the dark sometimes contain in them exactly the kind of truth that the darkness was put there to protect. He was asking it the way you ask when you know that some objects hold the weight of entire lives, and that the person across the counter from you might be carrying something they haven't yet understood. He was asking it the way Marcus Dell asked things now, which was the same, and not the same, as the way Marcus Dell had asked things before. Some doors once opened do not close. Do. Some passages once walked through change the territory on both sides. The shop was the same shop. The wall was the same wall. The photograph was the same photograph. But the man who stood in the shop, in front of the wall, and had looked at the photograph every morning for 11 years had become, over the course of 5 weeks, and a box left by a dead man for his son to find, a different iteration of himself. Not the version that had come before. Something new. Something that contained both what he had been and what he had built himself into, and that had found, finally, a way to make those two things coexist. He looked at what the woman placed on the counter, and he began. Have you ever found something that rewrote everything you thought you knew about someone you loved? Share your story in the comments. And if you believe that some truths are worth the cost of carrying them into the light, subscribe. There are more stories like this. More people who deserve to be remembered. Silence is never the final answer.